Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, uh, dear sisters and some brothers who are also joining us in support. I think we can just begin so that we can also honor the time of our guest. And as we begin, we'll have some of the other sisters joining us as well as we continue. And so just before we begin with the program, I want to ask one of the participants who's here today to please volunteer themselves for the opening invocation before we can start. Anyone who would like to volunteer? Anyone?
Hello.
Yes.
Do
Yes,
you hear?
Tika.
It's the first time for me. I didn't attend the introduction or the definition before. So my name is Siham Saeed Salim. I'm from Egypt, from Sinai, especially from the Bedouin people in Sinai. This is as an introduction for me. I'm graduate from political science, British University in Cairo. That's it. This is the first session for me. Do you hear me?
So, yes, Siham, thank you. Would you like to do a short prayer for us as we start, before we start the session?
Sorry.
Can you please do a short prayer for us before we start the session?
A short for what?
A short prayer.
I don't know how to say it actually. I don't understand so well.
No, I'm saying, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Can you please do a short prayer?
I don't know really.
Okay, it's okay. Thank you and welcome, Siham.
Thank you.
Is anyone else who would like to volunteer to do the prayer?
Hola Winnie, buenos días, buenas
Buenos
tardes,
días,
buenas
Orte.
noches.
Good morning, Winnie. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening. I will do it, Winnie, while the participants get used to the idea of signing up for the on the list that we have for today. So I will do the invocation.
Gracias, Orte.
I'll do it here from Guatemala. Thank you, Orte. Today, from the Maya cosmovision and our culture, I invite you to reflect on the essence in each family. In Nahuatl, for us, it means what is a sign of life? A sign of life in our families, our peoples, our cultures, all the cultures and peoples that have survived throughout the history. We want to thank the life giver and to the energies of Mother Earth, Father Air, Grandmother Moon, Grandmother Water, and the energies from Grandfather's Sun and Grandfather Fire. These four elements are essential elements for life. They're also the elements that help us breathe, nourish ourselves, calm our thirst, and also to cook our food. The essence for today, the Nahuatl energy is to maintain and support our families. And today here we are as FEMI's family. So we are grateful for the opportunity to share here, to be together, even if virtually. We know that each one of us has a different way to connect with the universe, but from our lifestyles and the way we think, we know that this is the way that our grandparents have left for us. In this process that we are engaged in today, learning, we're also going to recover our practices, practices that are really our rights to have. So let's start today with good energy, with that desire to continue living, continue learning. Let's open our minds and our hearts so that everything we do can be positive, and let's try to capture everything that we have to do. Thank you to life and the universe 1, 2, and 3 times for allowing us to be together and to be here and challenge the borders, uniting our energy here together, and let's hope for a wonderful week. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Orte, for that opening invocation. Just a reminder to also our participants that there's a sign-up sheet to sign up for the invocation in the days and the sessions to come. So please do so. And so welcome back to another session we have. And today we have our first expert who's going to take us through some our lesson today. Her name is Maria Eugenia Choque. She's a Bolivian Aymara woman. She has a degree in social work, a master's in Andean history, and a PhD in development sciences. She's part of the network of Indigenous women and biodiversity in Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2014, she was chosen as an expert, a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Likewise, she was a teacher at the Public University of El Alto, the Major University of San Andes, and the Technical University of Oruro. To this day, she continues as a strong Indigenous woman advocate and is a strong ally of many Indigenous people's organizations. We want to thank Maria for joining us. She has been an ally to the school and has joined us before. And so we're very grateful to have her here with us to share in her experience, in her wisdom, in the knowledge that she has. And so please take advantage of this moment that you have with her to ask her as many questions as you like from the session. We will have her do her session, and then afterwards we'll also have Orte doing another session. But Maria, please feel free to direct the session as you please. And then we'll have questions. So we'll have her first and then question and answers later, unless we're told otherwise. And so welcome, Maria.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon.
Bueno, primero quiero agradecer por este
I, above all, would like to thank you for starting this learning process, this process of sharing together with the purpose of seeking, let's say, a better life better well-being,
un restablecimiento
um,
desde que
a way of reestablishing,
un restablecimiento
recovering what us
de
Indigenous
nuestro
peoples have been,
gobierno,
recognizing
de
our
nuestros
government systems,
conocimientos y saberes
our
indígenas,
knowledge,
de
our
nuestra
Indigenous
forma de ser y pensar
knowledge,
respecto a lo que
our
es
way of thinking, our way of living,
una relación muy estrecha con la madre
having a very close connection with Mother Nature.
estamos en este camino del
So that is the path
restablecimiento
that we're
de nuestros
following
derechos y por lo
to
tanto,
recover our rights,
el
we establish our
proceso de
rights,
aprendizaje, el
and
proceso de
that's the
fortalecimiento de
learning
nuestras
process, the
capacidades,
strengthening process of our
de
abilities, of our skills,
estos talleres,
is also an important part of that purpose. That's why we have these workshops,
reuniones,
these
vamos
gatherings,
a decir, diálogos
or
constructivos,
dialogues,
y también desde la academia.
and also from FIMI.
Oportunidad,
So
¿verdad?
it is a terrific opportunity, and I am grateful to FIMI for inviting me here, and I'm grateful to you for being present here today. And in that spirit, as our colleague said in the invocation, this is a gathering process, a dialogue process, a process where we seek our well-being. We all want to live happy and in peace.
Los pueblos indígenas cuando
And that will be possible for Indigenous peoples when our rights are in place, when our rights are recognized, and when we can indeed enjoy all of what the international standards, international legal framework says. We're going to have a formal presentation first, and then we're going to move to a second part, working in teams. And then another brief session to conclude. We're going to discuss collective rights and individual rights of Indigenous women. These rights, as the title says, is going to be more in-depth looked at throughout this course. Throughout the various presentations, you'll see different experiences, a different focus in human rights, and how all of this has an impact and in the international legal framework. So we're going to talk about the basics on human rights, but dignity, equity, no discrimination. It's going to be, and we're going to do an analysis. We're going to talk about the indivisibility of the individual and collective rights, and we're going to talk about reparation of and reestablishment of our rights. So we have said that the objective is to contribute to the participation of Indigenous women, such as you, women leaders, with long experience or more experience or less experience, all on the same path, trying to have an impact on this international legal framework through what we call skills development, to strengthen our skills, our abilities. And this comes working collectively and individually. So that's why it's so important that we participate in full and effectively as women leaders. And for that, it's important to exercise our collective and individual rights. And that's why we need to seek that well-being, living in peace. Throughout history, human rights have a long history. They really come from the times when the conquest happened since colonialism. Our elders, our ancestors, what they've done throughout time and through their long searching for a way to reestablish their indigenous governments and their way of thinking, their spirituality, their languages. What they've done is work seeking that. We have to ask ourselves why, first of all, there was a establishment of colonialism, what was the justification rather, what was the historical event that allowed for this colonial establishment and control. So it is really a colonial domination, and those colonial fights are justified supposedly on the fact that indigenous peoples are inferior, that indigenous people are, as I said, half men, half animal. That was their justification to impose a colony and destroy that was quasi-animal. And that's how they established a way to obliterate our way of being, our way of living. Our fight is not just for equal human rights, equality in human rights, but also the inequality that exists. That inequality takes us to a process, let's say, let's call it a process to recover our identity, first and foremost. We have a common element in our identities, and that is that we share, and have always shared, or we've shared in the past, slavery, forced labor, in the mines, doing free work for our supposedly protectors. We've had a religion imposed on us, a Christ, which was used as a weapon to dominate us. So it's a society where little by little domination or dominance has been established little by little. And in that scenario, there's no respect for our cultures, because if they consider you half animal, quasi or somewhat animal, we're not people, we're not persons, we're not humans. We are considered as animals. So we have lived a history of inequalities, and we cannot erase that history, because our history, and we'll see later on, that it's actually something, a strong tool that we can use to recover what's ours. We cannot say that what happened is in the past. No, what happened in the past for our ancestors That was actually the motor that drove them to seek self-determination, because and perhaps a lot of peoples don't understand within the Spanish language what we call self-determination. But in Aymara or in Sumacamaya, in our native Sumarcamaya, it's what we use in our language in Aymara, and that means well-being. That word that we want to use is well-being. But seeking that well-being has been from the moment we started suffering that domination process, that colonial process. It has not been just an imposition in the political arenas, economical arenas, because our authorities have been destroyed, or in the spirit, and all that affects our spirituality, but just in how we see ourselves. We ourselves think that we are lesser, less than the white, less than the other. So it has been a long process to reestablish what like what we have in this question here. Who decides on what barbarism means and what civilization means? Who does that? Indigenous people? Well, that was established from a colonial domination. I can say what civilization is as well as any other. And the youth sometimes have thought that civilization is forgetting our language, or to leave our way of dressing, for example, behind, or that we have our things that come from our past are archaic and not good anymore. So that's why when we talk about our fight for our human rights, our fight, our struggle is about the inequalities that we live in. That inequality, under the justification that indigenous peoples are imperfect. We're not perfect. Those that are perfect, what's perfect is what dominates us. So, since that colonial process was established, it is very interesting to see that the first chronicles that were written about how they saw us, Garcilaso de la Vega, for example, paints Indians with faces of children, like children's faces. This representation, this imaginary representation, means really portrays that we require guidance by an older person, and that's really domination. So it would be important to read those chronicles to understand what they're using, what's their imaginary, was not true, and what's being used to impose colonialism. So we are in a situation of inferiority because the vision, the focus, I repeat again, is that we are seen as half human.
So we're also looking at what's perfect versus what's imperfect, what's good versus what is bad. And in this process, there is quite a bit of literature. I just pulled out these 4 legitimate justifications in the discourse of Valladolid. There's a lot of resolutions, there's a lot of historic letters, there's of people who went before the king or the queen and told of how they perceive the situation in the Americas. One of the justifications is that it's legitimate to dominate by force and by weapon human beings, men's, whose natural condition is that they should obey others. So immediately we were told we needed to be obedient. That was our role. It's sort of the concept of slavery. So that was one of the justifications for domination by force and by weapons. And that's why during the imposition of the colony, at least for Latin America and the Caribbean, we were described as people who needed to obey. And large indigenous cultures appear in the old literature as reduced to inferior cultures, inferior beings. If we look at the censuses now in our countries, we will realize how we have been physically reduced as a population as well. So the way the censuses are conducted are another example of how our population was reduced. You can see that through killings, our population was reduced.
Invocación a las deidades, a nuestros protectores, a nuestros cerros, a nuestros lagos, a nuestros bosques, a los ojos de agua.
Provoking anger of God with this monstrous rite of human sacrifice. And let's not forget that in the Bible and under the justification of being for God and for the church, we have been dominated. When the Bible was given to the Incas, Incans say, I speak with my gods, and my gods talk with me, and my gods respond to me. But I want to know if this God of the Bible will also respond to me. But when the Incan spoke to the God of the Bible, he did not find a response. And so for them, they saw the God of the Bible as a dead God, but the gods of nature, in fact, are living gods who talk to you and communicate with you. So the dominant culture saw our rights, however, as monstrous rights. They said that we engaged in human sacrifice. And so it was expressed in this way. And now, because of the climate change, and since we haven't had certain, we've had droughts, we haven't had rains even in the rainy season, indigenous cultures are going to the mountains with the children to offer offerings and to pray for rain. These are practices that have not been eradicated even today. And if you look at each experience of our peoples, we will find other examples. A lot of experiences and a whole potential wealth of our knowledge. Another justification that they use to legitimize our domination was that it was legitimate to save all of these innocent mortal people from grave dangers. The war against the infidels. Who were the infidels? The Indians. And its domination by force was justified for the sake of the propagation of Christianity. And of course, the introduction of the Christian religion has been a weapon that has served to impose colonial domination. And many of us in the various peoples, indigenous peoples of the world, have stayed there. We sometimes still believe that our way of thinking and being and our spirituality is at a second level. We are not seen by the dominant culture as having a culture of the same value. And so we have sometimes adopted that asymmetry. Sometimes I hear spiritual authorities say Mother Earth, Virgin Earth, a comparison between what is Mother Earth and what is the Virgin Mary. And so Mother Earth produces, predicts, gives you life, gives you food, gives you water and clothing, that gives you life, is also equated somehow with the symbolism of the Virgin Mary who gives life. And so because of colonialism and domination, many things have been taken on as if they were part of our own culture. Obviously, without forgetting the deepest part of our feelings. We have absorbed some of the colonial culture. Now, the colonial history, also includes the following. Our national states, the countries, have inherited these colonial administrations, right? And they have imposed a model of state and government, and we are called Bolivians and Ecuadorians. We are Panamanians. We are Argentines, etc. But our identities as indigenous people, for example, I'm Aymara. I've only been Bolivian since 1825, but I've always been Aymara. So we have to look at how the colonial administration model imposed legal and administrative systems, imposed academia and scholarship and language. And there's a man by the name of Bartolomé Clavero who is seen by the colonizers well, he says that the colonizers are not taking into consideration indigenous people as actors, as sovereign actors. They were called indigenous Indians, and we don't exist legally. And we're not in the national legal framework. Many states now have made some progress in recognizing the multinationality of a country, but in practice, the education system, the system of the administration of justice, the governmental system, the system of territorial administration, the administration of our territorial spaces, all of this has been placed under the conception of the nation-state system. And so the constitutions in general don't recognize that we have a national identity as Indigenous peoples, that we have a separate nation. In some constitutional reforms, different languages are recognized, but the teaching of your own language, like the languages of Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, and I'm sure other languages as well, that language is not taught really as an official language of the country. So the languages are recognized in law, but in the real practice, even the justice system doesn't use these languages. They have a different logic for the legal framework. And there's been a full-on attack in this colonialization process as constitutions have emerged in Latin America, for example. The titles of land and property are provided for by inheritance. And this also is a way of domination, as a way of positioning lands and territory. And collective rights of lands were bestowed by the crown. And so you do have some authorities who have then papers that say this land is ours. And some people in oral history have talked about how the lands were purchased with gold and silver. So when it was time for taxes, the Indigenous peoples would say, why do we have to continue buying this land? Because our lands have already been paid for time and time again with gold and silver. So in this scenario, it's important to think about how our states and our republics, have emerged. Now, from my experience and point of view, we have to work on the recovery of collective memory and the recovery of our knowledge, of our history, of our memory, of our languages, of our ways of being and thinking. Because our history is marked by a colonial vision. And the official history is written by the others, not by Indigenous peoples, and certainly not by women. That's why in the history of our peoples, we tend not to have an official history of our leaders. Very few communities have that written history. Maybe a handful. But there's also a historic silence around the role of women and women's leadership. There was Bartolina Sisa and Gregoria Pasa and Micaela Labastida, who we know about in the current processes. And these current processes have to do with recovering our history, writing it down. And within that recovery of our history, we have what we talk about as the recovery of memory and tradition. Why do we talk about collective memory? Collective memory is important because there's a similarity in our history as Indigenous peoples. Among the various peoples, we've all been dominated in a similar way. And we have oral traditions, we have myths, we have songs, we have weavings that have lasted throughout time from before until now. We have stories that are part of our history. And it's through those mechanisms that we can learn more about our history and to know more in depth. So the oral tradition is very important. But who carries on the oral tradition? Indigenous women. We are the ones who tell the stories. The recovery of collective memory is a way of returning our pride to us as Indigenous women. So collective memory has a base of anti-colonial resistance. It's an ideology of resistance. And we are trying to recover our language through our elders, and we're trying to continue to practice our customs today through this resistance. And in this whole process, which we can say has been a process of colonial domination and the process of establishing the external, the foreign, on top of what was already here, it's important to look at human rights as a way of thinking about the need for reparations. And so in the midst of all of this, we have the declaration, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One point also that I have seen that's very important that will be gone into further depth in future modules, but I want to mention it here as well, that this is an instrument that helps us to recover our pride and dignity as a people. This declaration, this UN declaration took more than 20 years to be written and ratified, but it's a powerful mechanism, a powerful tool that we have. And so it was a historic milestone in the Indigenous movement. And it's very important because it reaffirms the commitment of the international community to Indigenous peoples, the respect and promotion of collective rights and as well as individual rights. And when you have this other group here, the Indigenous peoples, you must enter into dialogue and consensus building with this group. So I have described this as reconciliation between states and Indigenous peoples, but if the right to consultation and free prior informed consent and the right to self-determination are not respected, then it is not reconciliation yet, and our struggle continues. The declaration does consolidate international law on Indigenous rights. It contains principles and laws that recognize and establish international legal framework, and it's a base for a new pact, a new agreement. It is a pact that has been worked out together. And in the Andean case, it's talking about an agreement between the state and the Aylus. The Aylus are what we call the organizations of the Andean indigenous culture. So what is this reciprocity pact with the state? How does that work? It means that as we have laws and more laws and more laws, you have to say, well, we have this pact now that says, yes, we pay taxes, but our authorities must continue to function. Our chiefs must continue to control our territories. They must continue our own governmental authority. And it's not this, change of government every 4 years, depending on who speaks better. No, we have our own form of electing our authorities. And these new pacts with the state allow indigenous peoples to continue with our own organizational structures. So the UN Declaration is an instrument, it's an international set of laws from which we can create national laws and agreements. And based on that, we can have more relationship between the government, the national government, and indigenous peoples, but based on respect. And also in these modules, we're going to be talking about equality and justice. And this unceasing struggle for justice and equality is happening because currently we are not seen as equal persons, and therefore the struggle for equality continues. And this is essential for the continuation of the life of indigenous peoples. Our cultural subsistence, our spiritual ways of being, the continuity of our languages, the respect for our territories, respect for our way of thinking, respect for our indigenous governments. All of those are collective rights, and collective and individual rights are part of this new international legal framework now. Here are some key elements of the declaration. We have our self-determination. Self-determination understood as social, cultural, spiritual, and political development, and the freedom to pursue that, pursue our own development. And so indigenous peoples, under this international framework, have legal space to say, okay, we have a possibility of making progress towards the good living, the search for a good way of living, and the reestablishment of our justice system and our rules. It talks about indigenous languages because obviously that's important, not because you have to speak a language, but because behind the language you have identity, culture, and history and forms of thinking. And embedded in your language is everything that has to do with our reason for being. Language is simply the intermediary and the vehicle for this continuity. But unfortunately, because of colonial processes, both our knowledge and our languages have been weakened, and many of our young people, because of the need to migrate, the cruelty of migration and the cruelty of domination and the cruelty, which is the imposition of other ways of life, many of our young people have lost their languages. There are Indigenous peoples where there's very few families that still speak the native language. The languages are being lost, and this is very unfortunate for us because when a language dies, a people dies. Language is the base of the meaning of different plants and animals and places. They are the symbols of a cosmovision, a worldview. We make a concept and it's not just a technical concept for communication. Our concepts are conveyed through our indigenous languages. And so it's very important. In the declaration, there is a part that is more about democracy, where we try to work on what is equality. The declaration also recognizes the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which is very important. And we will be looking at what kinds of laws exist in your countries in local and national areas, and to see if this right of free, prior, and informed consent is part of your national law. This is very important for Indigenous peoples. When we talk about access to resources, especially resources that are in Indigenous territories, we all know that territorial resources and legitimate property of our property is legitimately belongs to the state according to our laws, but the right to territorial land, for example, Indigenous peoples can own the surface of the land, but what is under the surface of the land, according to many laws, belongs to the state. And so they're finding silver and gold, and if they find it in your house, that under the ground, that belongs to the state. It doesn't belong to you because it's a natural resource. That's what many of our laws say. So the principle of free, prior, and informed consent is of vital importance. Here, for example, this international instrument of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's important to realize that it's not an establishment of new rights. We're just talking about the rights that we already have as Indigenous peoples, but it has a binding effect on your national laws for obligations to be met by the state, or vice versa, rights and obligations. Or the right to the exercise of collective rights, the respect of the right to exercise your collective rights. And so the principles of the human rights focused on the UN system from the perspective of the declaration lie in this background. All of the rights have the same status. There are no rights that are more important than other. And the right to your own language is as important as your spiritual rights, or as your right to education, or as your right to your forms of production.
So, así como es
Another
importante
right cannot be negated, cannot be violated, just like land and territory, which is a space where it's strengthened, is rebuilt. The land and the territories are rebuilt and and strengthened. So that is such an important element
porque es el espacio de vida de los
because
pueblos.
it's the space that gives life to the people. It's a natural space where identity comes from. So in this process, many of the people, of the indigenous peoples, lose their structure. That changes life, that it gives way to migration. You're no longer listening to nature. You're not listening to birds singing when they let you know whether it's going to be a lot of rain, or there's not going to be production or good crops that year, or when water disappears, or when there's a climate crisis. Then your land, your territory, that's a spiritual element. It's like the economic motor.
Si antes tenías vacas, producías papa, verduras,
If you produced
pero por la sequedad ahora,
potatoes, or if you had cows or different things, that was great. But if water disappears,
entonces
and it disappears because of contamination, you're obligated to migrate
no hay cómo producir.
because there's no other way to produce, right?
Son las consecuencias que vivimos.
So that's the consequence of the
El
times
otro
we live
punto es
in.
no discriminación e igualdad.
Another important point is no discrimination and equality. Discrimination is a structural problem,
Y hemos
right?
visto cómo
And we have
cómo
seen
instaura
how
una forma de estructura.
a
¿Sí?
structure, a particular structure is established. If we analyze our countries, for example,
En el caso de Bolivia,
in the case of Bolivia,
eran, por ejemplo, marcas. Marca es
there
un
were, for example,
marca mecano con C, como
marca
marca
with
es un
a
espacio
K
territorial
is a
grande.
territorial space that is large,
Después
it's
de la
extensive,
marca, el suyo, una cosa más
and then after marca there's suyum,
territorial, más reducido.
uh,
Está
a
después
smaller territorial
los
space.
islas, que son un
Then we
espacio
have
más
islands,
pequeño,
which is a
que
smaller
forman
space in the
varios
community.
forman un suyo y varios suyos forman una marca, un espacio
It's a
territorial.
suyu and then various suyus
Pero
with
la
which
normativa
marks territorial
nacional
space.
dijo no,
But the national
aquí son
right, the national
cantones,
laws said, no,
departamentos,
we're going to call them cantons or cantones, Spanish departments. They restructured the space.
y ese es un problema.
And that
pues,
is a
estructural, porque desde arriba
structural problem
realmente han
because
desestructurado tu forma de gobierno.
they have from above
Entonces, ¿cómo
restructured
trabajamos
your
cuando
government, your
hablamos de
space?
autodeterminación, de
So when we
autogobierno?
talk
¿Cómo
about
trabajamos en un espacio que sea
self-governance, how do
desde
we work in a space
desde
that
¿no?
is
Entonces, la
our
declaración
own?
dice que, pues, no debe
So the
existir
declaration says that
discriminación.
there shouldn't be discrimination, right?
La discriminación a las mujeres, todos sabemos
Discrimination
que
against
discriminación a la
women.
mujer y a
We
las
all know that
niñas,
discrimination against women
que sufren
and
y
violence
es
that
como
children suffer,
recordaría uno
it's like
escucha información
something we
y la
live
violencia hacia las mujeres
daily.
están
And violence against women, it's so
no sabemos
strong.
si antes había más violencia o después,
We don't know whether there was
las
more
mujeres han accedido
violence or
realmente a
not
espacios de poder,
later on, but
¿no?
since
Desde
women have now
el
been able to
ataque a la
get to
indígena
positions of more
y el
power, there's been
ataque a la
violence against
dignidad,
them.
¿no? O
They've
sea,
been attacking
uno
their
construye
dignity
con tantos sacrificios
with so many sacrifices.
como mujer, aymara, quechua, guaraní,
All women, Aymara, Quechua, Guarani,
mucho proceso.
all of them have suffered a lot. But as they say, the cat has 7 falls and 7 times they get up. For women, that's not the case. Every time they fall, it's harder to get up. And society sanctions you and punishes you, sometimes on the basis of invented, made up stories. If they want to attack you, that is violence against Indigenous women. And it is really easy. I was in jail in less than 10 minutes. I ended up in jail. That's my own experience. So the attack on women's dignity is easy. It doesn't cost them anything. They just have to lie, right? And women themselves sometimes are not solidary at all. It's something we need to work, sorority and solidarity. It's very unfortunate when we talk about the situation of women. They're very vulnerable in terms of human rights. The same for women, Indigenous women and girls. Mothers educate them internally, not telling them this is how it should be done, but sometimes by watching the boy or the girl watches, and that's how they see how things should be done. If they watch spiritual practices, that's how they know how spirituality is lived. They watch how it's lived in the families. They go to school, then to preschool, and the first thing they do is to uneducate you, to take your culture away and bring you to a different culture. That's violence, right? So women are discriminated against just because they're Indigenous, darker faces, brown faces, because they're Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, Maya, Quiche, just on the basis of their ethnic origin. And even though society at large may say they don't see it that way, that's the reality. Even if you have academic degrees, you will always be Indigenous and you will be treated as such. Any young person talks to you with contempt. In some societies, speaking in the informal you, as we have in Spanish, it can be accepted in some, but in others, in Aymara society, it's interpreted as someone who is of the same age. It's disrespectful. It's treating someone with disregard, with contempt. They treat you as they treat their domestic employees, as if you were disabled. You are lesser. Those messages are subliminal, are under the surface, and we need to learn to interpret them. Because those of us who have lived the last couple of decades have suffered discrimination at universities, and those of us who have suffered a discrimination process of that nature, it's something very impactful. So I see in the chat a comment that is a symbolic discrimination. Indeed, there is a symbolic discrimination. Women live this. Women feel that on their skin, We would like to be able to react to that. But for example, our skirts, the skirts Aymara women wear, we call them by other words. We used to make them we used to make them with weaved yarn from alpaca, but now we use more modern cloth. Now you go to the minibus, to go to the bus or to any public transportation, and you see that they look at you because you're wearing that skirt. They don't even talk to you. They laugh at you. It's the indigenous skirt that we're talking about. So I heard at an office a woman who said something, and it really upset me. A woman at an office was not being attended to. She asked something, and the other woman scolded her. What right do they have to do that? One doesn't have the right to ask where to go or to ask for directions. In Spanish, women suffer that. They don't treat you right. They don't value you, and that hurts. We have a lot of work to do. The other principle, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, the principle of inclusion, that consent, as we had mentioned before, is of vital importance, is crucial. We have to react to the fact that for centuries, over centuries, our resources is what maintains the states, the governments. It's from there that they pay their bonuses, their administrative expenses, their travel, everything. But we are the labor force. So this principle of free, prior, and informed consent is a basis of human rights. So what do we need to do to really make it effective? From there, we have to also do a lot of work with our brothers and our sisters in the communities. Sometimes they just tire you out. They exhaust you. Companies, mining companies come to you and they bother you once and again and again and again. And what do? If we, for example, look at the leader who communicates with them. This has to, they sometimes come to us, to those leaders, saying, I'm going to get that yes one way or another from them. And that's why we see that there's a little co-opting towards the leaders. They give a lot of misinformation. They offer jobs. They offer work. They offer, for example, works like changing the school roof. But what is that in comparison to the cost? They may give you $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. The long-term cost is much higher. There's contamination that will wipe away waters, will wipe out and contaminate water. There won't be crops. There won't be feed for animals. So we have to think about that process when we talk to them. Indigenous peoples have the right to say yes or no, but fulfilling our principles in our own language, with dialogue, with agreement. That process has to be worked on with the communities because we still suffer colonialism. So we have to have negotiations in good faith in our own language. We need to be able to do that. We have always said yes, and that is why the poverty index is so high. So we need to go beyond just mere consultation, not just consultation, but consent is so important. They need to be able to meet all of this under all those principles. So collective rights refer to the exercise by indigenous peoples as collective subjects. We have an identity as people belonging to a territory, and the law in terms of territory has made our rights individualized, and there titling land to women is one of the rights, but the rights have been individualized. They're no longer collective. So an individual facing a whole collective, you become weaker than if you were a collective. But the right is there. It's an achievement because there were cases, many cases, where owning land was something that men could do. Women didn't do. You never owned your land. You worked it, you lived there, you live, and you live your culture in relation to your land. So it has been something that has required of a lot of analysis, a lot of reflection, because there have been many cases where, since you don't own your land, family members, your partner, they themselves end up casting you out, tossing you out of your land. So it's very important to have that right to the title of our land. So it is in the territory where culture, government, legal administration, ways of economic life, political life, spiritual life are formed. We are similar, but also different because of how we relate to our own ecosystems. So in terms of collective rights, many of the countries recognize the collective subjects, the collective subject rights. So in Colombia, for example, they've been saying, well, it's really deception. It's not true, but it's important to put into practice, to be able to put into practice everything involved in this right. So how they repair, if we think about indigenous reservations in Colombia or in the United States. So it's important to be able to talk about those realities when we have a situation that is recognized, such as those. So territorial identity based on the relation, the spiritual relationship with the territory. We have said that this is something very important, and it could be in a way the guarantee of the continuation of living our way of life and enjoying our natural resources, water, land, air, subsoil. So what we mean by our whole autonomy. So we need to have access to all of these, to our resources that are in our biodiversity and our Mother Earth. And a very important point as well, to live our culture, our identity, our systems, our way of thinking is traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge has suffered a lot. It is undervalued. That's something of the Indians, of indigenous peoples. That's from the past. And we don't realize that the climate crisis, the development that has happened up top, has caused these changes. It rains a lot, there's flooding, there's drought, there are earthquakes, destruction. So the contribution by indigenous peoples with their knowledge is crucial.
Also, when we talk about collective rights, we have international instruments that are important. We've already talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, which is the first-rate international instrument. It's the best one that we have. But also we have these other international conventions and international instruments. The International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, Convention against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading punishments. We also have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have a Convention on the Protection of Migrant Workers, International Convention on the Protection of People Against Forced Disappearances, the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So even if there's not a specific mention of Indigenous people's rights or Indigenous women's rights here, the CEDAW, for example, is an instrument that we've been able to use a lot, and that's the Convention of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And we have some recent conventions as well as ones that have been around for many, many years, but the leadership of Indigenous women and the sisterhood among Indigenous women have allowed us to make sure that some of the recent instruments mention Indigenous women specifically. And here I'm just going to go over very quickly and do a summary of the participation of Indigenous peoples in the creation of various norms. For example, in 1945, you have Indigenous authorities demanding to be part of the Organization of the United Nations, and that they have negotiating power from state to state. So the participation of Indigenous peoples is recognized, and it's not recognized from the very beginning, but little by little spaces are opened up. In 1957, we have Convention 107. In 1972, we talked about the problem of discrimination against Indigenous peoples. And you have the COBO studies where the UN shows through investigation, research that's happening local and nationally, they're able to show through these studies the problem of discrimination. And they are emphasizing the colonial imposition. Everyone knows that there is a process of discrimination that Indigenous people are experiencing. In 1977, you have the International Conference of NGOs, non-governmental organizations on the discrimination against Indigenous people in the Americas. In 1981, the International Conference on Indigenous Peoples and Land. And here you have the demand for free, prior, and informed consent when anything is being done on our land. In 1982, we have the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples. And they debate a number of topics: education, culture, territory, development, economic development, and various topics. In 1989, you have Convention 169 of the ILO. And then you have the Earth Summit in 1992. In 1993, you have the International Year of Indigenous Peoples. 1995 to 2004, you have the first International Decade of Indigenous Peoples of the world. In the year 2000, the Permanent Forum, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is formed. And that is the group of Indigenous peoples. That is the space for dialogue and debate and to come out with resolutions through the Permanent Forum here. In 2001, you have the Special Rapporteur's Office on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was created. From 2005 to 2015, you have the second International Decade of World Populations or Peoples. In 2007, you have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that we've talked about. Also in 2007, you have the group of the expert mechanisms on the rights of Indigenous peoples. 2014, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. 2015 to 2030 now is the Sustainable Development Agenda. And we also should have a date, which is 2019, which is the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which then turns into an entire international decade from 2022 to 2030, International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So it's important to know about these various spaces that were created and opened out and in which Indigenous peoples have been able to participate. And Indigenous women have been on the forefront of opening these spaces and in providing follow-up to these spaces. It's very interesting because well, even though reduced and small spaces began to be created and you started to see recommendations, but all of this can be converted into advocacy at the national level. So right now, the various national states should be promoting programs to establish Indigenous languages in formal education and in higher education. So this is sort of the umbrella law that helps you to ask your national government to make changes. In terms of the international rules on environmental rights, you have the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Framework Convention. Currently, there's 198 countries that have ratified this Framework Convention. We also have the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity, which in 2022 had 196 countries that were signatories. And also that they have goals reflected in the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, the fair and equitable participation in the benefits derived from the use of genetic resources is another goal. We also have the struggle against desertification, and that comes from the convention related to the environment and land management, and that has to do with the droughts that have been happening. So there's a struggle against desertification and drought, and to mitigate the effects of droughts in the affected countries. So practically speaking, here we're referring to places in Africa, but currently we can see this whole climate change process is affecting all of the different regions and countries and local communities, indigenous peoples. The problem of desertification is something that we are experiencing day to day, year to year, and it has a terrible effect on the production of food. We used to have more abundant production for the local markets, for the consumption markets, but also we have been losing traditional seeds and genetically modified organisms have been imposed, which is destroying the variety of traditional and ancestral seeds. And these ways of cultivating are being lost. And so this convention really tries to focus on desertification and to raise awareness about it. At the same time, the treatment of land and water resources has different kinds of legal frameworks that have been created. So, because if you don't take into consideration ecosystems and territorial practices and our agricultural calendars of our communities, in one of our communities, we said that the farming cycle has to do with when you plant and when you harvest and how you rotate your crops. But what we're seeing now is that migrants are coming and becoming residents of La Paz, and they plant when they want to, they harvest when they want to, and they're breaking with the whole traditional cycle that we have maintained for years. And so that's why it's so important that this system of management and treating territories should be done based on traditional knowledge. We also have what's called the Escazú Agreement, and that basically refers to access to information and capacity building, protection of the rights of each person. Here it's more individual, not collective. The right to enjoy a healthy environment and have access to sustainable development is part of this agreement, and the right to talk about what kind of development we want. Measures for cooperating and strengthening capacities, the participation of the population and Indigenous young people, all of this is part of the Escazú Agreement. Now, the next topic is cultural rights and the rights of Indigenous women. All of us know that culture, at least for us, is the fundamental pillar for the development of Indigenous peoples, right? Because of women's close relationship with biodiversity, women's contribution in culture, with their knowledges and practices and a spirituality. And so we know that culture is important to women, and it's part of the answer of the climate crisis that we're experiencing today. So non-material cultural heritage has been transmitted from generation to generation, and this is also very important. We have lost a great deal of it, yes, but the cultural area is an area in which women really are the ones who are predominating. And we're talking about oral tradition, historic memory, oral expressions, songs, myths, and legends, weavings. Weavings speak for themselves and they describe your territory, the resources, the animals that you might raise in your home. This all is part of your right to culture and the exercise of your identity. We also have festivals, rituals, and rites, ways of healing and treating illnesses, the knowledge of plants, the knowledge of the sustainable use of resources for the treatment of illnesses. We also have to consider that this knowledge has to do with community life, which is related to the natural environment. There's the art of weaving, the expression of weaving, poetry, songs, and there's different songs to the fire. There's interpretations of that song in our case. And there's a whole teaching about how to raise llamas, for example, in our areas. The culture of Indigenous peoples are linked to our lands, our territories, and to all of our stories and songs and proverbs and rituals, and our beliefs and community laws, our local languages, agricultural practices, tools, and our close relationship to biodiversity. And I was talking about our Andean rituals, right? They contribute to knowledge in the world as a different source of interpretation. What kind of meaning do we have in our rituals? How often are they done? Who participates? How were these rituals carried out? And how they've changed. What kinds of things are the same? What kinds of things have changed? What kind of elements of continuity or discontinuity or rupture are we seeing in our rituals? All of this is important when you talk about your culture and your rituals. Here I just mentioned a few things about our Andean rituals. And these images are from the Chronicles of Guaman Poma de Ayala. And it shows us the ritual of the offerings to the gods, something that we continue to do, naming Father, Sun, Mother, Moon, the stars, the lakes, the mountains, as protectors of the life of Indigenous peoples. This has not changed. We continue to recognize these deities. Perhaps now, for example, we're in carnival time now and tomorrow. Tomorrow is the Chaya, which is something we do in the Andean area. It's an Andean ritual to thank Mother Earth for what she gives us. And so we make offerings to the Mother Earth during this festival. And this rituality allows you to develop some reciprocity with Mother Earth. Mother Earth means reproduction, means health, means life. And we also have to think about cultural rights and Indigenous women. Cultural heritage based on identity goes throughout time and space. Our heritage is something that is constantly renewing itself. So we have the old and we have the new innovations. Indigenous peoples are always innovating and building their ways of thinking, and their ways are ways of relating to biodiversity. Here, I want to reflect a little bit on how we revalue our memory, or how we recover which is falling through our hands. We have something called Keep Naira. It's an Andean thought that means, well, Keep Naira means to look at the future, but as you recall the past, that we have to learn about the past to be able to move into the future. So this is the whole exercise, and you see it in academic spaces, in daily spaces, in practical life. It is an instrument, the engine that helps you to build and rebuild and recover identity. Our identity, as expressed in different spaces, in different geographical spaces. Our identity is built and rebuilt on the base of what happened before and what is happening now. And so what we have is, for example, advocacy in the oral history. We have references to struggles of our past and fights for territory and for our resources. And there's a lot of literature on our struggles and rebellions, our process of defending our territories. And during this century, we're also recovering quite a lot of history about judgments on territory. And Indigenous peoples were never winning these court cases on territory. And education is important because we have learned that we need education to be able to read and write to defend our rights. And that's something very important in our process of recovery. At the same time, we have recommendations for the strengthening of our own procedures and laws. By university training, I'm a social worker, but at the university I also studied Andean history. And my process for researching my thesis right now has to do with learning about Indigenous knowledge. And for me, the oral tradition as a methodology is important for research, but also actions for recovering our organizational structures. And we can be supported by oral history in this process. And these are stories told from year to year by women from their own focus and vision, from our own focus and vision. And we also have the recognition of the value of identity, recognition of ourselves as peoples, recognition of collective actions, advocacy from the local area to the regional, national, and international areas. And in the Andean case, we have the process of reconstituting our organizational systems, like the AILUs and the marcas. We also have advocacy processes that give us some opportunities to work on public policy, such as autonomy of Indigenous peoples.
Los procesos de reparación son procesos
Reparation processes. Those processes are in Article 40 of the Declaration, and it's very important to take into account that the effective reparation of everything that we've talked about, domination, the patriarchal society, the imposition of laws, restructuring all of our ways of organizing, loss of our language, of our identity, recovering our own land, our territory, respecting the ecosystem, respect of our spirituality, all of the things we've been talking about, all of those are part of the reparation process of the human rights of Indigenous women. We have suffered historical injustice, so an effective reparation is necessary. It's something overdue. It is necessary that our customs, traditions, norms be respected. It's time, right? Otherwise, our peoples will be dismantled. So I feel that we have difficulties such as lack of participation by women in the different levels, at the different levels. So we need more advocacy at the local, national, and international levels. But we are not advocating to be in good terms with the government. Sometimes we keep quiet. No. We need to advocate. We need to not keep quiet concerning women's rights and protecting those rights. Another difficulty, another challenge is that women suffer violence in many ways at different levels, especially when poverty is prevalent. It's necessary to create different commissions within the countries, and we need Indigenous women to do their own research. We have a wealth, a great potential, because through our native languages, we can access our sisters. We can write about ourselves, for ourselves, about our struggles, and about the forms of violence.
Nuestros nietos, nuestras hijas no
So that
continúen.
our granddaughters, grandchildren continue with these challenges. This is the practical activity. We are going to have a practical activity right now on these three reflections. And if you can please help me with the technology so that we can divide in groups, into groups. And we're going to give you time to dialogue about those 3 points, and we'll give you 20 minutes. And nominate someone to guide you in the group, and also someone who's going to present your like a summary of what you discussed later on to the entire group. And then there will be reactions, comments, questions about what is presented from each group and from the presentation that I made earlier. So if there are no questions, we'll proceed to the groups. Yes, good morning. We're going to divide in two groups. One will be in the main room with interpretation, and the other one will be English speakers. And since we have Winnie, because we have Winnie and Hortensia, is that okay, Hortensia and Winnie? Hortensia says it's good.
20 minutos y
Right.
los voy a mandar el grupo en este momento.
So
Sí,
you will have 20 minutes. I'm going to send you to the groups right now, and we'll be back in 20 minutes to present our comments. And then there will be a last section or segment to ask questions, to make comments, and conclude this presentation, this hour. Thank you.
¿Listo, Hortensia? Ya puede comenzar.
Gracias.
Since the groups are divided, you can go ahead.
Vamos a seguir con este.
Thank you. Good morning again. We're going to continue with this exercise. How interesting the presentation by our teacher earlier today. Now we have the opportunity to react to all of this information and to get to know our own history, our own stories. It's crucial to be able to understand our present time and design our future. So we're going to have this space now for dialogue and reflections and comments and Hello?
Hey, hi.
Hello. I
Hello.
think we are running out of time. I think all of us do understand English, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, we understand.
Uh,
Yes, I
should
understand.
we just continue because our time is running out?
Yes. Yes, I think whatever points or maybe whatever we understood, we can just someone maybe just jotting down the points. No?
Yeah, I'll take the notes. Can we start? We don't have much time because we only have 5 minutes now.
Okay, I just want to share something because what I understood, she was saying based on the last 3 points, I guess, no, the lack of participation. So just wanted to share on that part that from my part, of in Indigenous women here, forget about participation. We don't even know actually what are the rights of Indigenous. So that is one thing which I feel that, there is, we don't know about this. So this is even for me, it's like first time, so I'm getting to know a lot of things. So just one point from my end.
Can we please asking what's the question exactly she want to know answer or something like
Hi,
that?
hi everyone. Sorry, I was not able to come back sooner. I've just posted what the questions are on the chat.
Experience from the
So just so that you can have reference to what she's asked that you discuss amongst yourself. And I don't know, have you already selected someone who's going to report back?
No, we couldn't do that.
Okay, because
So
we don't
yeah,
have
let's
a
just
lot of
go
time left.
around.
Can you
Yes,
go
let's just go
around?
around and share on the questions that we have posted.
Yeah, can you please share 1 point each, and then can one of you please volunteer to report back because we only have about 4 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm taking notes. Can
Okay,
we go on?
all right. So okay, I'll just call out people so that it's faster. So can we start with you, Nicole?
Yeah.
I'm typing my question on the chat box for Pema.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Nicole?
Yeah, we do have some revitalization oral cultural knowledge here with Native Americans. I think it's pretty strong. Lots of women do participate, but unfortunately there's like a lot of lateral violence between other Indigenous women, so it's not like the safest place to be.
Sorry, what violence did you just share?
Like I said, lateral violence, so like jealousy and not like being supportive of each other.
All right, thank you, Nicole. Irene? Okay, let's go to Maria before Irene comes on.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. I want to contribute on the rights of the Indigenous women. Back in the community, most of the Indigenous women do not understand their rights. So it's a challenge, and also they experience different types of violence, such as economic violence, gender-based violence, and also psychological violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Irene?
What I can say is in our community, women still face so many challenges. There is violence against them every time, especially on the land rights and even the no, they even sometimes they can't even allow them to go to school so that they can understand their rights. They can be able to write and read, so it's a big challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Anima?
Actually, I've posted in
I've
the
posted
chat.
on the chat.
Oh yes, you have. So your pan, I'm sorry if I butchered your name.
Oh, no, it's okay. I think our time is running out, but the biggest issue I think the women in my community are facing is land rights and militarization. So the violence we have is kind of centered around those things and kind of how hard it is to participate on the international stage because Indigenous Chamorros don't actually have very much political power. So, yeah.
Thank you. Siham, as we conclude, you can write your responses to Tama as she prepares to present. You can write directly to her.
Okay.
Yeah. But Siham, you can go ahead before we get cut off. I'm sorry.
So I will write it as a comment here, right? Do you mean?
Yeah, but I'm afraid if you write it as a comment here and we get removed from the chat box, I mean from this room, we lose this chat. So you could just start to speak and then when we get moved back, you can continue on the chat directly to Pema. And then the rest of you can also talk about, some of if you have regulatory or frameworks in your country or in your community, you can also write those to Pema as well. So Siham, please go ahead before we get cut off.
So write it or say it.
You can say it before we leave.
Okay, as some of one said that they don't allow them to go to school or something like that. Here we are like a Bedouin community to some extent. They prevent women to go to high school, for example, universities or something like that, because they just think like, okay, it's okay for you read and listen and so on. So this is enough for you. You don't need to go get a high certificate and so on, because you at the end of this you will go to your house's home and that's it. So you don't need. And many women here like they want to go to university, but they don't allow them to go. And this is happened to one of my friends, and was so sad for her. Yani. I think this is a kind of violence. Yes.
Yes. So because we are not caught off, I'll also just share mine. So here in Nepal, most of our indigenous women in practice are free. We don't have as much restrictions as some of how our sisters have shared. But in terms of actual policies, in the constitution, other minorities communities are specifically pointed out in our constitution, but indigenous women regarding all their rights, we are not clearly defined in our constitution. But and also a lot of minority indigenous communities who are still residing in their motherland, in their territory, they are being executed, they are being forcefully internally displaced by militarization and and from the state, in the name that these communities are invasioning the
states' lands, because they don't have any legal documentation on those lands. A lot of these communities are evacuated using military force, and in those incidences, in those kind of human rights violation incidences, it's usually the indigenous women and indigenous young children who are mostly impacted a lot. There has been a special case of Chepang community in which a lot of indigenous women have been sexually harassed, even raped. A lot of children were killed from the army and their invasion. So those are some kinds of direct violence that our indigenous women are currently facing. And also, due to the language barrier, there is also significant lack of access to basic services like medical services, and even access to justice mechanisms, because they don't understand these languages, which makes them even more vulnerable to these kind of sexual abuses from other non-indigenous communities. So these are some of the incidences here in Nepal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pema. Does anyone want to share any frameworks that you have in your country that you want to highlight? Also, I know today Maria shared a lot of information about different frameworks and different conventions and stuff like that. Don't worry about it. We're going to have, in the next few months, we're going to go through some of those frameworks in the sessions that we're going to have. So this is not the end of being of having someone share about the frameworks. So again, if I see that there's a chat that we're closing. So please, if you have any of those regulatory or so this is a constitution or something like this that highlights the plight of women, you can write it directly to Pema on chat when we go back to the main room.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. And Nicole, can you please write me a WhatsApp? I think I wrote you last time.
Oh, you need me to send a WhatsApp?
Yeah, please, because
Oh.
I can't add your number to the group.
Oh, okay. Let me
Please.
see. Can I put it in the chat, my number?
Yeah, I have your number from the list I have, but I can't add you on WhatsApp because you're not visible on WhatsApp for me.
Okay, let me see. I have a WhatsApp. I'm just not seeing anybody wanting to connect with me on WhatsApp. What's your phone number? Can you send it to me?
Yeah, I'll chat it to you.
Nuestra cosmovisión. Entonces, sí quiero recalcar eso, también la incidencia de...
To emphasize this as well, that it's important for us women to do advocacy, to formulate different policies. It's important, but it's difficult, of course.
De trabajar también con otras mujeres, ¿no? De hacer...
And it's really important to work with other women collectively, because in the end, it's something that we have to all do together. We can't work on it individually. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you, Citlali. And thank you to all of you. I think we're all together here again. Everyone's been able to come back, right? Are we in plenary?
Sí.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Entonces, vamos a seguir con las. Queremos agradecer todas las
We're going to continue, and we are grateful for all of the comments and opinions expressed thus far. And what Sister Maria Eugenia shared with us has been very important because we can question a number of realities that we're living in based on what she has said. In order to claim these rights that we have as Indigenous peoples and as women, it's true that violence affects our daily lives as Indigenous women, and we need these spaces of dialogue, and more than dialogue, of mutual support and self-support to be able to confront what we have to confront every day. Every woman in her daily life in Indigenous peoples, as a number of you have shared, are in a situation where our principles and values that clash with the Western form of thought. And all of these realities create personal and internal conflicts. And even though we all deserve so much respect, many of us attend Catholic churches or Christian evangelical churches and other such denominations. And I want to talk about this very quickly because when you start learning about your history and reality, you start to question all of this and we start making decisions. Should I continue here? Or should I reconnect with Mother Earth and Father Air? So as we make that transition, we also need spaces where we can share our experiences. I'm talking out of my own experience here because taking that step and making a change in our lives is because we're trying to reach what we all want. We all want to be happy and we all want to be able to live freely in our daily lives. And when we talk about Indigenous women, we know that we are those who tell our communal stories, but it's harder and harder to do this, and it's a struggle to recover these stories. Our grandparents had a stronger connection, and they are like an oak tree with a strong connection to our past. And so we need to be able to talk with them and ask them about everything they know. And if we let that opportunity pass, we will lose our opportunity to learn so much about what they know. We have some time left to continue with our sharing and reacting. And we've heard about the experience from Indonesia. And you can see that racism is something that's present all over the world. But as she was sharing in Indonesia, women sometimes are ashamed to practice their own spirituality. And some of us have already been through that phase, and others are just beginning to confront that phase. If I take on my identity as an Indigenous woman, then sometimes I have to leave some practices behind and to take up other practices. Would anyone else like to speak right now to share some of your own experiences in this space? We have some time left to be able to do that. Fema, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello everyone. Tashitele, I'm Pema Wangmo. So I'm representing our group where we had our friends from Asia, Pacific, and even North America. So first, I'd like to share some of the points. Our sister from Bangladesh, representing Tripura community, Ani, my sister, shared. She shared that in Bangladesh, a lot of indigenous women don't even know about their rights. The lack of participation is a very far thing. They don't even know about their rights, and a lot of community are also converting into Christianity, which is also conflicting with their own belief with which they have own God. And she also asks about how to protect their community from not being influenced by the majority beliefs. I think Anima sister will also add a bit more on that. And similarly, our sister from North America, our sister Nicole, also shared that a lot of indigenous women do practice their indigenous practices, but despite that, there are a lot of internal violence in their communities because due to the jealousy and other conflicts happening in the community, which is also contributing to a lot of violence uh, and not making them able to not creating enable space for them to exercise their rights. Similarly, Maria's sister from Kenya, she also shared that a lot of indigenous women don't know about their rights as an indigenous woman, and are also experiencing a lot of violence, especially economic violence, gender-based violence, and psychological violence. And also, Sister Irene from Kenya also shared that a lot of indigenous women do not have access to education, formal education, which is also hindering their full access to other rights. And similarly, our sister Sibon from Pacific shared that her indigenous community, Chamorro community, don't have strong political power, due to which they are facing a lot of risk in terms of their land rights, and which is also causing a lot of invasion in their motherland, which is also creating a lot of violence within their communities. Similarly, Sister Seham, if I'm pronouncing it right, from Egypt, shared that indigenous women in their community are not provided with higher education. They are perceived that indigenous women don't need to read or write. It's just being able to get basic education is enough for them. They don't need to get higher education because they are going to stay in their household. So that is the kind of perception towards indigenous women, which prevents them from getting higher education, due to which she also shared experience of her own friend who was not allowed to get higher education, higher degree. So that's what she shared from Egypt. Similarly, in Nepal, I'm sharing some of the incidences in Nepal. In Nepal, land rights for indigenous people is not legally recognized, despite we are the signatories of UNDRIP and also ILO 169, but our land rights is not legally recognized, which is making a lot of indigenous communities victims of forced eviction through militarization. And in those incidences, in those human rights violations, the indigenous women of these communities are most impacted. They face a lot of sexual harassment, abuses, and even rapes, which also happened to a Chepang indigenous community in Nepal recently, last year. And similarly, in our constitution itself, a lot of other marginalized communities are specifically mentioned in the constitution, but indigenous women are not recognized by the constitution. So regarding that also, and even in terms of language, a lot of indigenous communities language are not legally used in the formal processes of government and even in justice mechanism, which also hinders their access to a lot of rights regarding justice, education, and free practice of their indigenous cultures. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por esas.
Thank you for sharing all of those realities and opinions with us. There are many, many challenges, especially for women, Indigenous women. And we need to be more visible in different spaces. And we'd also like to hear from the other group as well, please. Somebody from our group, would you like to share some of your reactions?
Hortensia.
Sí, sí, sí.
Hortensia, yes.
Tiene la mano levantada.
Anima, you have your hand up?
Yes.
Por favor.
Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, good evening. I was just trying to add on. Firstly, I am actually representing India. Tripura is inside India, not Bangladesh. Secondly, is I very much agree with Hortensia that like she mentioned on transition. When we realize that we have been practicing, our spirituality, and now because of new religion has taken over. So when you understand the rights of our indigenous, we question whether we are going in the right way or wrong way. So that becomes very difficult as a woman, because I think children are born from women, and it becomes very difficult for us which practices should we share with our children. And so I think women plays a very important role, and the dilemma is for women now that uh, what should be I following? Like I probably may be the second generation who is following Christianity, though I'm not a very, I'm not an atheist, though I believe, but somehow I am right now in that transition mode. And it's really confusing, and a lot of things are diluting. When we talk about spirituality, there are many things because it comes with our culture is affected, our tradition is affected, our practices is affected in a way. So if I'm talking about my state right now, amongst the indigenous, we already have two religion now. Like when we say two religion, our practices and the new, the people have started accepting Christianity. So there are already division within our own indigenous people, and there are already, people not accepting the indigenous religion, you can say. So how do we tackle this as a woman? I'm just trying to find that probably it's a little sensitive, and I may not get the right answer, but I think I need more clarity on this from the seniors here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por compartir su experiencia.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, because this is a reality that we have to talk about in different spaces. And as you have said, this is a very sensitive topic. So I'm going to give the floor over to Juliana at this point. Yes, thank you very much, Hortensia. Yes, definitely. In our group, we had very similar topics that we talked about, similar things that happen in our countries. For example, the situation of national legislation. Not all countries recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples, much less the issue of the rights of Indigenous women, which is a more complicated situation. As Indigenous women, we have that triple obstacle of being women, of being Indigenous, and also because of the economic issue. And so this has affected our participation quite a lot and our ability to advocate in different spaces. So if we talk about religion, for example, religion is really important in the lives of many women. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the sister here who was talking about sexual violence, and so that you don't end up being seen as a bad woman, you have to marry people who have assaulted you or raped you. And so married women are living through very complex situations because of machismo and discrimination and racism. And we were also talking about the topic of the recognition of land and territory and the role of women in the relationship to conserving these lands and territories. But even though they play this role, their role is not recognized. The fact that they have been involved, that we have been involved in the struggle. Also, the right to education is still a really important topic in our communities because many women are not given the right to study because we're women. Now, this has been changing, but there's a lot that we still have to do to overcome machismo, where only men have the opportunity to study. Women shouldn't because women are going to get married, and women don't really have a reason to study. Also, in terms of who owns the land, it's not very possible for women to inherit land because they're women. And so there are other topics like this that we discussed. And if I've left anything out, perhaps the sisters in my group can jump in and add something. The topic of legislation, which has been mentioned, is similar here. You may have rights that are recognized, but they are legally, but they are not, those rights are not seen in practice. That recognition of the rights of women doesn't translate into the actual exercise of those rights. So it's important to continue to do trainings and to make partnerships and to work together so that we can continue to strengthen our processes. We know that we can't move ahead alone, but with these capacity building places, we can open up a road and help to make our rights as Indigenous women reality. Thank you so much, Juliana, for sharing this information. Would anyone else like to share something or to react to what you've heard?
Bueno. También una de las grandes reflexiones que hemos realizado.
One of the things that we have reflected on a lot in these spaces is that this is all a process. Now, our program is directed to Indigenous women, and we have the opportunity to talk with great leaders in the Indigenous women's movement. And they have taken so many steps and are so far ahead of us, like Maria Eugenia Choque. She's such an encyclopedia of knowledge. And fortunately, we have the opportunity to share with her and to ask her about her own process. What kind of knowledge were you born with, and what did you learn along the way? She has shared some of this, but we can also try to take advantage of her presence with us to learn more. When we talk about violence against women among ourselves, we need a lot of support from others, and we end up becoming a group of mutual support in that sense. All of this experience, all of this resistance and capacity to resist is something that we can learn from each other. I want to go ahead and give the floor to Pima. Go ahead. You have your hand up.
Thank you very much. I just, after hearing all reflection from the sister, I just have few things to share. Me as an Indigenous youth, I'm in my 20s. So me as an Indigenous youth, what I feel like what's going on in my country right now is that because the world is moving so fast ahead that we have to be in the So we have to grab those opportunities that are here. We are being affected so much by the globalization and by all these technical innovations, that me as a youth, I have to keep in track of these new innovations and everything that's coming up, to have a progress on my career as well. But what that I'm feeling is affecting is that we are losing our connection with our indigenous knowledge and indigenous histories. Before, our sister was in the session, our sister shared about collective memory, and that kind of reflected me back into our community, that despite our community, our mothers, sister, our grandmothers are still practicing those knowledges, are still practicing those skills, but those are not being transferred intergenerationally well. We are losing the essence of why these practices are actually happening. Why do we practice such kind of, why our indigenous knowledge are so important, why it is so important to be connected with our lands. I was lucky enough to be shared these kind of knowledges, and I have those connections, those respect to my land and those respect to my cultures. But I see a lot of indigenous youth who are losing those essence, who are not being who are not yet connect, who are losing their connection to their mother earth, who are losing their connection to their indigenous histories. So when we are also talking about not getting rights from the state, that is a very valid question. It is, we are also, I think, at a point that we have to question our own, we have to question back to our own communities, that how well are we transferring this knowledge so that it will sustain to what's the coming generations, and how do we ensure that our knowledges, our skills, and our territories are not lost in the hands of globalization and the increasing advancement of technologies, and how do we keep our youth connected to our land. I just wanted to share that. And I just also wanted to know more about how we can how we can go back to our communities and do more of activities that can help to connect these, to help that can help for the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and movement. Thank you.
Gracias, Pima. La verdad es de que
Thank you, Pima.
la memoria histórica es fundamental.
Historical memory is fundamental, and it will help us to make good personal decisions to live collectively. I want to see if anyone else would like to speak. Would anyone like to share an opinion or a response perhaps to something someone else said?
Bueno, mientras se anime,
Okay, well, you are thinking about it. We are almost ready to close. Yes, dear Hortensia, thank you so much for the support. Since time has gone fast and we don't have much time left, perhaps I can just add to some of the reflections that you all have made, and also perhaps leave us with some questions. When we talk about spirituality, well, we can say that Indigenous peoples do live our religion and our spirituality, but as the sister from Indonesia was saying, the arrival of religious sects or the Catholic Church itself has led to the destruction of our own religiosity, our own religions. There are different names. Here, for example, we have traditional spiritual authorities, and they have different names according to the specialty that they are attending to. And what has happened is that these religious sects and religion have basically served to divide our peoples. This is a reality, and it's something that's happening every day in our communities.
¿no? ¿Qué hacer? Es
How do we
importante.
work on that? What do we do? So it's very important to keep in mind education, strengthening our knowledge. And I reiterate the issue of oral history, collective memory, oral memory. I come from an experience of having been part of the working group on oral Andean history. And for our process, we need to start learning in our own homes. First, we had to see where we came from, asking our elders, our family members, those closest to us, who are we? Where do we come from? What do we think? What has happened? Right? What has happened with the adoption of more modern, supposedly, last names and surnames? Instead of Walpara, a very indigenous last name, they changed it to Alfaro. So they were Spanicized. So there was a time where we really moved away from our identity. So I think that each one of us has to start by thinking, how do we recover, or reflecting on how we can recover our identity? And what do our elders, our grandparents, our uncles and aunts and our parents, what do they say? That has helped us look at history almost like a movie, showing the suffering, but also how much rebellion, how much death, but also how much resilience and resistance. So, as someone has said, we need to look at our own history, look at our own home. And from there, we have to think about how to work with the community. And that work with the community obviously implies thinking about how to return that information. We returned it in radio novelas, for example, the movement that happened in more or less 1400s. It was 1800s to 1945. There's a story, that section of history that was expressed in a radio novella. That's how we learned the persecution that our elders suffered, how they changed our last names, how they had to do that so that they wouldn't be persecuted and expropriated from their territories, how they've been jailed and how many times they've been jailed, how they died. That mythical history of what we have as peoples, these stories that at the time indeed were real, but now they're considered mythical. Mythical in the sense that their memory continues to open our paths towards the light. These radio novellas have allowed people to listen and to make corrections sometimes. Because, for example, not any type of music is performed with a particular type of instrument. During the times of sowing or planting and collecting our crops, there's a particular type of music and a particular kind of dance, not like at the city, anybody dances anything at any time, but we have a calendar for those festivities, for those celebrations. So they have corrected us as well through listening to those stories. Not just because you go to the university, you know more. Sometimes even your knowledge gets distorted. So how do we recover all of this? people would come with their colonial documents, because we also have to move with documents that are from our historic archives, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, because there's history behind our peoples, and that is in our documents. So people will come and say, look, this is my document. We would also like to include that in our history. So we created the Indigenous story, and we faced issues. Oral history is so important because we had to include names that were in that history, and we had to include, we obviously needed to include the role of women, because although they moved in silence sometimes through history, they were always there. How do we rediscover our history? How do we write it? How do we spread that history? How do we become stronger with everything we have, everything we are, everything that encompasses our history? It's not that I always have my nose in old documents. What's interesting is to know what has happened and how now we need to become stronger. That is an education process that is really important. Another point is legislation. All of the laws in our states are colonial laws. The little bit that we were able to get was through a lot of struggle and fighting and effort and jailings. And within this process, we need to also reflect on sexual violence, violence against women. That happens daily. Women who are beaten, women who if because of any situation they report a situation or an aggression, sometimes they're persecuted and killed. So that issue of violence is very important. Also, something very important, as our sisters have already said, is language, the richness, the potential of our languages. In the sense that our projects, our research projects, the way we think, our programs should motivate to not lose those languages. So I really invite you to write about our community's histories, to ask our elders on any issue, on violence, on languages, on culture, on access to territory, land rights for women. So we need all of that to do our work with our elders, respecting our elders, respecting our identity, our culture, and to strengthen our organization process. Women are really good at that. We're always ahead in that. And that has made it possible that all of these indigenous people's issues have been present. That's why they've been present at the national level, at the international arena. All right, we're running out of time. It's been a terrific opportunity, a great pleasure. We'll have another session together in March. So we'll see each other again. In the meantime, I invite you to reflect
el tema colonial,
on everything we discussed on colonialism and its persistence, and the continuity of colonialism, or the existence of all of that in the culture that has been imposed on us. Our struggle is constant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sister Maria Eugenia, for sharing with us all of this information and for awakening in our participants and all of us the interest in writing all of our stories, the stories of our peoples. So we're about to close. So I'm just going to ask Janeri, you'll have a minute and we have to close. I think she was asking to speak, Janeri.
Hola, gracias Hortensia.
Hello, thank you, Hortensia, for this opportunity. What I wanted to add, after all of this exchange of knowledge that we're sharing, exposing our own realities from our countries, from the perspective of Indigenous women, and the different challenges that we face, I also wanted to add something that, for example, is happening here in Nicaragua and the Caribbean North. There have been a lot of invasions of our land, and we as Indigenous people, based on everything we're seeing here, we want to be in harmony with Mother Earth. And the invasions that we have seen from third parties, each one of them has been invading our nature. And for the Mosquito people, nature is like a part of us. And if they invade nature, it's like they're mutilating a part of us. So these are situations that have been very difficult. A lot of people have died in this struggle, wanted to protect their patrimony, their heritage. Is not just a piece of dirt or land. It's heritage that tells you where you come from, where your history is, who you are. And unfortunately, that's one of the situations that we're living. So through the knowledge that we're learning, such as she said Maria Elena, meant Maria Eugenia. So the information shared by Maria Eugenia telling us that we need to understand this and write about our history, that is so important. A wise person, a wise man from the Mosquito people once said that a people without writing about their struggles, it's a people that is vanishing. So as long as we Indigenous people can continue to write about our struggles, we will continue being alive through our knowledge and through our language. Thank you. Thank you, Janeri. With this, we're going to close our session for today. We're very grateful to our sister Maria Eugenia Choque, to FEMI's team, and to you, participants, to our interpreters who are doing a lot of work so that we can communicate today. We'll see you on Wednesday, and we invite you to please write your names on the list to do the invocation every day. Thank you for sharing. Have a wonderful beginning of the week and a very successful week. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you on Wednesday. Goodbye.